All right, so welcome everyone. We're diving into something pretty interesting today, China's perspective on global relations, international relations, all that.
hmm
And we're going deep, right? We've got a fascinating source to work with, a speech by Xi Jinping himself. He gave this to celebrate, commemorate 70 years of the five principles of peaceful coexistence.
Right.
But we're not just going to skim the surface here.
Yeah.
We're going deep into the source material,
Yeah.
looking for those hidden gems, those nuances that you might miss if you're just reading a quick news summary.
Absolutely. And it's amazing how relevant these five principles still are. I mean, think about it. They came about in a world just after World War II, facing the Cold War. Everything's changing. There's this, real desire for stability.
Yeah, crazy times.
Exactly.
So, okay, five principles. It sounds a little, I don't know, like a self-help book maybe, but we're talking serious geopolitics here, right?
Yeah.
So break it down for us. What are these principles and how do they fit into China's whole idea of a community with a shared future for mankind? That always sounds so utopian, like something out of Star Trek.
Right. Well, each principle is kind of a building block for how nations should, treat each other on the global stage.
Okay.
So first, you've got mutual respect for each country's sovereignty and their territory.
Right.
No one wants to feel like their borders are constantly under threat.
Makes sense.
Then non-aggression, no using force or even threats. It's like a global chill-out policy.
I like it.
Third, no interfering in each other's internal affairs. Countries get to manage their own business.
Right.
Fourth is all about equality and mutual benefit in any interactions. Think fair trade, not exploitation.
Yeah.
And finally, peaceful coexistence, aiming for that global harmony.
Wow, it really does sound like a recipe for a more peaceful world. But it's been 70 years. Has it actually made a difference, like in the real world?
Oh, they've definitely had an impact. Xi Jinping actually points out how they've, shaped international law and made it easier for countries with totally different systems to actually work together, finding common ground where you might not expect it.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, and he really emphasizes how these principles have helped developing countries, particularly after colonialism. They've had a chance to, find their own way.
That's interesting. It's like China's trying to position itself as a champion for these countries almost.
Right.
But how does this all connect to the whole community with a shared future idea? Is it just a fancy way of saying we're all interconnected?
It's more than just a slogan. Xi Jinping sees it as the natural progression from those five principles, recognizing that now the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, they don't care about borders. It's shared future intertwined interests, no matter what your political system is.
Right.
He even quotes a Chinese proverb, a boat can only move forward when everyone rows in the same direction.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connection here. But is this just talk? Or is China putting concrete actions behind these words? What are they actually doing?
Well, he outlined some pretty ambitious proposals, strengthening the UN for one, and promoting those global development initiatives that tackle things like poverty.
Okay.
He even talks about encouraging dialogue between different civilizations. Imagine a global town hall meeting, but with a lot more tea involved.
I could go for some tea right now.
Right.
But those are some pretty bold ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get real. Can they actually work? The world's a pretty messy place, full of conflicting interests.
Yeah.
How does China address that in this whole vision?
Well, that's where their focus on peaceful development comes in. Xi Jinping makes it very clear that he rejects that old model of colonial powers or those hegemonic ambitions. He's pushing for win-win partnerships,
Okay.
mutual benefit. Think of it like a global network of collaborators, not a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses.
Okay, I can see that. This whole partnership model, it sounds good in theory, but in the real world, how does it actually work? Are there any specific examples we can look at?
Well, take the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Mm.
China is investing in tons of infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, all across Asia, Africa, Europe, creating jobs, boosting trade, connecting economies.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
It's a huge undertaking.
It is, and it's definitely controversial, right?
Oh, absolutely. It raises a lot of questions. Is it really a partnership or is it creating dependency? Are they really meeting local needs or are Chinese interests coming first?
Yeah, it's almost like there's this delicate balancing act going on here.
Yeah.
China's trying to be a leader, but not a domineering one, right?
Exactly.
And with projects like the Belt and Road, they're definitely changing the global development landscape. There's no question.
Yeah.
But that raises questions about China's role on the world stage, right?
Yeah.
Do they see themselves as a partner, a competitor, or maybe a little bit of both? And How are other countries, especially the big players like the United States, reacting to all of this? I mean, they must have some thoughts.
Oh, they definitely do. It's funny you should mention the US because their reaction to how China's engaging with the world is a big part of all this. It's kind of like watching, a geopolitical chess match with each side making these strategic moves. And a big piece on that chessboard is the global south. These are those countries in like Latin America, Asia, Africa, Oceania that are still kind of finding their place on the world stage.
Okay, so Global South, we hear that term a lot. What exactly does it mean, and why is China focusing on them so much? Is it just about the economics, or is there something more to it?
The global south represents massive potential, both in resources and people. But a lot of these countries, they still remember colonialism. They're cautious about new forms of exploitation. And that's where China steps in. Xi Jinping has been very clear about standing with the global south. He talked about shared experiences, mutual respect, and supporting their own ways of modernizing, not imposing a model.
So it's not just about throwing money around, it's about building relationships based on a shared history. That's smart. But let's be real for a second. China's not doing this out of pure kindness, right?
Well,
There's got to be something in it for them, too.
of course, there are always strategic interests involved. For China, engaging with the Global South helps secure access to raw materials, expands markets for their goods, and gains them diplomatic support on the global stage. But it's not a one-way street. Many countries in the Global South see China as a partner who gets their challenges, someone who can offer real solutions, not just lectures.
I see how this is playing out in places like Africa, where China's been investing heavily in infrastructure. It's a win-win, on the surface at least. But how do the other big global players see this growing influence? Are they just sitting back and watching?
Not really. There's definitely a sense of rivalry, especially from the US and some European countries. They're worried about China's long-term goals and whether these partnerships could tip the balance of power. You hear terms like debt trap diplomacy, suggesting China might be using loans and investments to gain control.
It sounds like a tense situation. This competition for influence in the global south, could it, spark a conflict down the line?
It's a risk, for sure. If things get out of hand, we could see rising tensions, proxy wars, and the global order splitting even further. But it's not a foregone conclusion. There's still space for diplomacy and cooperation. It all comes down to whether these global powers can, manage their differences and work together on the big challenges.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Xi Jinping also talks about multilateralism and the UN's role. It seems like China wants to be seen as a supporter of the current global order. But at the same time, there are those concerns about their human rights record, what they're doing in the South China Sea, and their overall ambitions. How do we reconcile those two sides of the story?
You've hit a nerve there, that inherent tension in how China's acting globally. On one hand, they're a permanent member of the UN Security Council, they've upped their financial contributions, and they're vocal about defending state sovereignty and non-interference in other countries' affairs. It all lines up with those 5 principles we talked about earlier.
So they're playing by the rules, at least sometimes.
It's more complicated than that. While supporting the UN framework, they're also pushing for changes that would give them more say within the organization. And there are accusations they use their economic power to, pressure other countries and silence criticisms about things like human rights.
So it's like they want to have it both ways, benefit from the current system while also reshaping it to their advantage. That's a bold strategy.
It is. And it makes you wonder what a world order shaped by China would actually look like. Would it be fairer, more multipolar, like they say, or would it just replace one type of dominance with another?
That's a big question. I sense a but coming.
But it's not a simple either situation. There are lots of gray areas, and China's approach is still developing. To really understand it, we have to go beyond the rhetoric and look at what they're doing in the real world.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces keep moving.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm starting to see a pattern here. China's vision for the future is all about this careful balance between working together and competing, between upholding the current order and pushing for change.
Precisely. And that's why understanding their perspective is so important. It's not about predicting the future, but about giving ourselves the knowledge and critical thinking skills to navigate this increasingly complicated world.
Well said, 3. Speaking of navigating complex issues, I think we're ready to dive into the final part of our deep dive, where we'll unpack what this vision actually means in the real world and what it means for how the world is governed in the future. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into China's vision for international relations. It's been quite a journey, right? Lots of twists and turns, definitely more gray areas than a foggy morning.
Yeah, we've uncovered some pretty fascinating stuff, that's for sure. And as we look at what all of this means in practice, I think it's important to remember that China's not just, talking the talk. They're actually walking the walk, especially when it comes to like global economics and how the world economy is governed.
Right, exactly. We talked about the Global South earlier, but this goes way beyond that. China is a major player in the global economy, and they're making some serious moves. So how does this whole vision of a community with a shared future actually translate into, concrete economic policies? What does it look like in action?
Well, think back to those 5 principles we discussed. Equality, mutual benefit, win-win situations. China has benefited enormously from globalization and free trade, right? They've become an economic powerhouse, and they're very open about promoting those same principles to other countries.
Yeah. But there's a bit of a kind of a paradox there, isn't there? On one hand, China's all about open markets and free trade, but on the other hand, there are all these concerns about their trade practices, intellectual property issues, and some even accuse them of protectionism. How do we make sense of that?
It's a balancing act, no doubt. China is trying to navigate a very complex global landscape where they're both a rising power and, still a developing country. They're pushing for a more equitable global economic order, one where they have a bigger seat at the table, but they're also very, very protective of their own interests, which makes sense.
So it's not as simple as saying China is either for or against globalization.
Right.
They're playing a more strategic game,
Yeah.
right? Choosing which aspects benefit them the most.
Exactly. It's about what works for them at this stage in their development.
So what does this mean for the future of globalization itself? Is China trying to, rewrite the rules of the game completely?
They're pushing for changes, definitely, but I don't think it's about destroying the whole system. Think of it more like, renovating an old house. They want to see a world where power is more spread out, a more multipolar world, not concentrated in the hands of a few Western nations.
Okay, multipolar. We've been hearing that word a lot lately. What does it actually mean in practice? Is it just a fancy way of saying more countries get a say in how things work?
Imagine a world where decisions are made through collaboration and consensus, not just dictated by one superpower. That's the vision China is promoting. Think about the G20, for example. That's a platform where the big economies, including China, can actually come together and help shape global economic policy. It's not perfect, but it's an example.
Okay, so a world with more voices, more perspectives. That sounds good, right? More democratic, more representative. But isn't there also a risk that things could get, a bit messy, with everyone pulling in different directions and maybe not agreeing on anything?
Of course, it's a double-edged sword. A multipolar world could be more dynamic, more innovative, but it could also lead to more conflict and gridlock, especially if there aren't clear rules or ways to resolve disputes. Remember what happened before World War II? The world was multipolar then, but it wasn't exactly a peaceful time.
Right, good point. So a multipolar world isn't some kind of guaranteed utopia. There are both opportunities and challenges, as with everything. But how are these big ideas actually playing out in the real world? What are some concrete changes we're seeing?
Well, look at institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. China started this one. It's a development bank focused on funding infrastructure projects in Asia, and it's a direct challenge to the World Bank and the IMF, which are, traditionally dominated by Western countries.
So China's not just waiting for a seat at the table anymore, they're building their own tables. That's a pretty strong message, right? How are other countries reacting to this? Are they excited to join in, or are they feeling a bit threatened?
It's a mix, really. Some countries see China's initiatives as a great opportunity, a way to get investment and boost their development. Others are more cautious, worried about China becoming too powerful and trying to, impose its own vision on everyone else.
It's a high-stakes game, that's for sure, with no clear winners or losers yet.
Oh.
But I think one thing is clear. If we want to understand what's happening in the world today, we need to understand China's vision. It's that important.
Absolutely. And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive. We've gone beyond the surface, looked at the nuances of China's approach, and considered what it all means for the future of international relations, global governance, all of it.
It's been a fascinating conversation. I hope our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of these complex issues and maybe even some new questions to ponder.
Exactly. And that's the whole point, right? To keep the conversation going.
Exactly. So to wrap things up, we want to leave you with one final thought. In a world facing climate change, conflicts everywhere, and economic inequality, can China's vision of a community with a shared future actually offer a way forward? Or is it just, Another chapter in that age-old story of power struggles and competition.
The answer, as with most things in international relations, is complicated. There's no easy answer. But by engaging with these ideas, by understanding different perspectives, and by constantly asking the right questions, we can become more informed, more engaged global citizens. And that's a good thing, I think.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time, ready to tackle another fascinating topic that matters.